Hi YouTube, it's Emily. I'm here with you for another video today. I decided to make a video about swim bladder disease in fancy goldfish. So if you follow me on my Instagram, you'll know that recently I unfortunately had to euthanize one of my adult goldfish due to her sort of chronic battle with swim bladder disease. So I thought I would make a video today to sort of talk about swim bladder disease, what it is, some common sort of myths about it, or to clear up some confusion that may exist about it, and to give you guys some tips that you can try if you happen to have a fish that has swim bladder disease. So I am sitting here in my fish room in front of my 55-gallon tank. I'm sitting here because this fish, Shiner, she's one of my adolescent age fish. She's probably about 8 months old or so now. And she's not doing it today, obviously, because I'm trying to film her. So she's decided to be swimming around perfectly normally. But she normally does have some swim bladder issues. There are often days where she'll be floating upside down on the surface. There are days where she basically is just unable to control where she's swimming around in the water. And so I wanted to sit down here just in case she starts moving around. You guys can see what swim bladder disease looks like in a fish. But like I said, she's not really cooperating, which is kind of unfortunate. So in order to understand swim bladder disease, you first sort of have to know, what is a swim bladder? So a swim bladder is an organ within the body cavity of the fish. In fancy goldfish, it is a two-lobed organ. So there is a cranial lobe, which means it's more towards the head, and there's a caudal lobe that is more towards the tail. And so this organ within the fish helps it to rise and sink within the water. So if the fish wants to go up to the surface, the muscles around the swim bladder will relax, and that allows the swim bladder to inflate and kind of buoys the fish up towards the surface. If the fish wants to go down to the bottom, the muscles around the swim bladder contract, causing the swim bladder to deflate a little bit, and they sink down towards the bottom. So fancy goldfish tend to have a little bit more issues with their swim bladder because they have been so adapted and bred by humans. In the wild, the carp is more like the common goldfish shape, so it's very elongated and narrow, and that is sort of the way nature intended them to be. And through time and breeding and our influence, we have bred the goldfish to have a much more round body, so it's shorter and wider than it is in the wild. And that has sort of caused all their organs to be in different places than nature intended it, so that they're all kind of squished in weird ways in there. And that leads to swim bladder disease. So it's kind of sad because it is our fault because we've bred them to be so pretty, but it has led to some unfortunate deformities. So true swim bladder disease is actually a physical deformity of the swim bladder. So most often it is the caudal pole that is affected, and in fish that have swim bladder disease, this caudal pole is either smaller than it should be, or it doesn't inflate the way that it should be. It's deformed, and that leads them to have obvious problems with their buoyancy within the water and things. But what really you need to understand is that true swim bladder disease is an actual physical abnormality. So it's a deformity that these fish were most likely born with, and it's something that is not going to be ever truly fixed without something like surgery. So which I don't even think a surgery exists for goldfish to fix swim bladder disease. So unfortunately, there's not really a cure for this disease, and that's something that you kind of need to understand if your fish does have true swim bladder disease, is that you need to understand that it's going to be, unfortunately, a chronic, lifelong problem that you're going to be managing. So then how do you manage it? So there are a couple things that you can do to help manage your fish if it does have swim bladder problems. And this is also probably one of the most, this is also sort of the misconception section, because there is a lot of misunderstanding about swim bladder disease within the fish community. So if your fish has swim bladder disease and you are looking to get advice about how to fix it, if you post, a video or a photo or anything like that on a social media site, inevitably you're going to get somebody who says, don't worry, you can fix this by feeding peas. And peas are not magical, all right? They're good for you. They're a vegetable, they're good for you, but they're not going to fix true swim bladder disease. So the reason why peas do sometimes help is that they make your fish, they serve sort of as a laxative or a large fiber meal and cause your fish to defecate. So if your fish is constipated, or if it has a lot of, intestinal contents within its abdomen, then that's going to be putting all that feces and intestinal contents are going to be putting more pressure on their swim bladder that is already compromised. So it's going to compromise them even further, and they don't have the reserves to deal with it. So by feeding a pea, you are causing them to defecate, and the intestinal contents are then decreased, and that allows their swim bladder to function more normally, although it is still abnormal. So that is why a pea, feeding peas or feeding any sort of vegetable meal to these fish often can make them better, but it's not going to completely fix the problem, because there's no way that you are feeding them anything is going to change the shape of their already deformed swim bladder. Does that make sense? So the other way you can help manage it in sort of the same vein is that you can fast your fish. So sometimes not feeding them anything for a couple of days does help swim bladder disease, and that's because again, their intestinal contents sort of empty over time, and that decreases the pressure on their swim bladder and allows them to swim more normally. So other things you can do if your fish does suffer from swim bladder disease is to feed them more fresh foods and less pelleted dry food. So pellets are probably the worst offenders in swim bladder disease fish, and in fact, if I feed Shiner pellets, like, I guarantee she would be floating. So I try not to feed this tank in general very many pellets. So pellets make swim bladder disease worse because they absorb a lot of water. So when you put the pellets first in the tank, they're very small. The fish eats up a whole bunch of them because they're small, and their eyes are sort of bigger than their stomachs, and they eat a lot of them. And then as they're inside their stomach intestines, they absorb water and grow bigger. So they get really, really full, fuller than they intended to when they were initially eating things. And that puts, extreme pressure on their swim bladder, and they get really floaty. So one way to help manage your fish with swim bladder disease is to sort of switch them to a more fresh food diet, or to switch them to gel food diets, to feed them regular meals of something that is going to not absorb as much water. So for this tank, I pretty much only feed them Rapashi's Soylent Greens and Super Green gel foods, and then I feed them fresh foods as well, things like bloodworms, brine shrimp, peas, broccoli, and spinach. So that's pretty much what this tank gets, and this tank gets very, very little pellets because of Shiner's swim bladder issues, and then Bella, my fish who I just euthanized, was also in this tank. So this was sort of the handicapped tank while she was alive. So those are the ways you can help manage your fish with swim bladder disease through diet. The other thing that can affect swim bladder function is water quality. So I think there's been maybe only one paper that's been published about it, but that's actually quite a lot of research to be done for goldfish in the goldfish world. There's not too much research not too much money in goldfish research, so there's not too much that's been done. But I did read one paper that found an association between high nitrate ATE levels and swim bladder disease. And I sort of do believe that I do believe this paper because I've had some personal experience with that. So when I first started keeping goldfish, I had this really tall, I think it was like a 40-gallon hexagonal tank, but with the tank and the stand, the tank was probably like 6 feet tall. And I did not have my Python water changer, so I was doing all of my water changes by lifting like large 5-gallon buckets of water over my head. And I don't know if you can tell from this video, but I'm kind of lacking in upper body strength. So doing water changes was like a whole ordeal, and therefore I didn't do them very often. Definitely not as much as I should, and my water quality in that tank was quite poor. I did have some ammonia and some nitrite even, but my nitrate levels were like off the charts, like insane-o high. So my one fantail that I still have in my 90-gallon tank, Athena, she was very, very, very floaty in that tank. Like I think she lived like upside down for maybe 6 months. My friends would call her like floaty fish, and that was her name. But so she lived like that for 6 months. She seemed happy, but she was always upside down, and my water quality was crap. So then I moved to my new apartment, and I got this tank, and I moved my 3 goldfish that I had at the time into this tank. And because it's much lower tank, because it's much easier for me to do water changes on this tank, I started to do them much more frequently, and my water quality improved a lot. So as that happened, she got less and less floaty. So she improved significantly. Now, it never completely went away, so I do still think that she has some abnormality with her swim bladder shape. So I think it's still, you know, deformed, but now that she is in a tank with very good water quality and on a diet that has gel food and is less pellets, she does much, much better. So she still has the occasional bad day, but for the most part, she swims around just fine. And so that's sort of 2 things that you can do to help manage swim bladders is make sure your water quality is good. Get a Python water changer. I love, love, love my Python water changer. Invest in the money in that because that will save your life. It is amazing. So get one of those so you can do your water changes easily and frequently, and then switch your diet to maybe something that's less pellets and more fresh food, and try even fasting your fish. I usually do fast my fish about once a week, so I just don't feed them anything for that day, and I think that is kind of good for them. So those sort of things are things you can do to help manage your fish with swim bladder disease. Unfortunately, swim bladder disease is sort of a lifelong chronic disease process, and it can be life-threatening and can be fatal. So I'm going to try and put in a video here of Bella swimming around with her swim bladder disease. So Athena, like I said, my fantail, she lived upside down for 6 months and seemed happy. Bella, when she had her swim bladder disease and she had her bad days, she did not seem happy. And I know people who don't have fish are going to sort of say, how can you tell if a fish is happy or not? And you just sort of know. She seemed very, very panicked, and she would swim very quickly because she seemed to be able to get where she was going a little bit better if she swam there really, really fast. She would basically come out, panically try to dive for the food, eat it, and then kind of wedge herself underneath a plant or a decoration within the tank and basically just sit there. So Bella is the mother to my fry that I have right now, and since she laid her eggs, she did not have a single good day. So I don't know if laying her eggs just basically shifted things within her abdomen, or if she did have something like an ovarian rupture or something like that. I'm not really sure, but after laying her eggs, she was really, really bad. She would still eat, but she basically never came out from under her decoration other than to eat. She was not normal for a single day. And then the day that I euthanized her, I came down and I found that she had these large red sores on her underbelly. And so those sores can develop in fish that have swim bladder disease just because they're floating at the surface so often and they're floating upside down against decorations or plants or anything like that. So they're getting a lot more air exposure and wear and tear to their underbelly that they're not normally used to. So she had these large red sores, and honestly, I probably could have fixed those sores if I, put her in her quarantine tank with medications and a little extra TLC for her. But it was sort of, for me, those sores were sort of the straw that broke the camel's back for her, because even if I fixed those sores, she was always going to have swim bladder issues. I didn't know if she would, really ever swim right again after she had laid her eggs, because she had, like I said, she hadn't had a good day. And it just wasn't worth it anymore for her or for me to keep fighting it. So it can get to the point where your fish's quality of life is affected by its swim bladder disease so much that euthanasia really is the kindest option for them, which is really, really, it sucks. But it is unfortunately the way that it is. So I would say definitely try to manage your fish with swim bladder disease for, as long as possible. Like I said, I managed Athena for 6 months, and moving her to a new tank and trying these things has worked really, really well for her. And she has only about, a bad day once a month now. Whereas before, like I said, she was upside down for 6 months. So they can make improvements, and some fish can make good improvements through these dietary and environmental management techniques. But sometimes, no matter what you do, you're still gonna unfortunately be left with a fish that has a poor quality of life. And at that point, you may have to decide to euthanize your fish just out of kindness to them. So that may be a little depressing way to end this video, but I just thought I would come to you and talk about swim bladder disease. If you guys have any questions for me or comments, feel free to leave them below. Please feel free to check me out on Instagram at Philly_Goldies. I'll put that link down below as well. And thanks for watching. Bye.